And we resume our discussion here. The first two sessions were in the framework of a royal colloquium on the same topic, on the topic of 1989 to 2019, from dystopia to post-history. We had 4 presentations and discussions, and now we move to the last part of our encounter here, our exchange. When we hope to get to a certain exchange with you. To start it off, I turn to Gregory Claeys, who is a professor of political science and political philosophy at Royal Holloway, the University of London, and who has been with us many times. We actually started this whole series, Ideas in the Agora, 2 years back, almost to the day, with a discussion about Marx and Marxism. Gregory Claeys, among others, is the author of this great book on dystopia. It was not only monumental, but also quite substantial. And we have been considering historical aspects of utopianism over the last many years, and together from a historic conference in Germany organized by Jan de Luzen, whom you are about to know in about half an hour or so, getting from the airport. Professor Claeys is also the president of the Utopian Studies Society, which every year and in between fosters new interesting research in fields could come together under the heading Utopia, Dystopia. He will make a presentation. It will be the last presentation in the program, and then we'll open the floor and we'll have a conversation. Greg.
Thank you so much, Sorin. Thank you all for coming. I'll be relatively brief today. I had to go on jury duty earlier this month, and it took a large bite out of my time, so I didn't have the chance to prepare something terribly formal, but it is, shall we say, different from in terms of the assessment of the legacies of '89 that we've been talking about so far today, and it is a theme we haven't yet touched on, but which I think we do have to confront. So historians always feel very awkward about talk about the end of history, because of course if history ended, we'd all be out of a job, and are appropriately much more skeptical, I think, of that concept, which has not weathered real history very well, as we've heard from the beginning onwards, but yet may come round full circle to be the voice and the imprint of the future, for reasons that I will try to set out here. So what I'm going to talk about is catastrophic environmental destruction. It is the single most important crisis and issue before us, certainly in Northern Europe now. It has, within a very short period of time, completely transformed the way in which we understand our immediate past, because so much has occurred in the last 30 years in this precise area, and because qualitatively the threat we now face has altered dramatically within only a very short period of time, the last year, namely. So, to start off, let's just remind ourselves of how far wrong we were from Rio and Kyoto to the Paris Agreements of 2015. We felt reasonably comfortable throughout this lengthy period, from 1992 now, with a narrative which suggested that the planet could survive adequately with between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius so-called global warming. I'm going to start by making a point about the language. Climate change, global warming, the two labels that we have pinned on this process for the better part of the last 30 years now are completely no longer acceptable, and a great deal of controversy has occurred, in fact, in the last 6 months. The Guardian taking the lead in Britain on this regard to insist that we don't use this language anymore, that we speak in terms of something much more realistic, which I'm calling catastrophic environmental breakdown. It's much more threatening, it's much more frightening, and people are starting finally, genuinely to express deep anxiety and alarm of a kind that can only trigger an appropriate response. So we need to look firstly at some fairly elementary facts respecting that comfort zone narrative of 1.5 to 2 degrees. In the early 2000s, the usual scenario that was laid out by climate scientists was that there was a spectrum of possibilities in the 21st century ranging from somewhere between the lower level that 1.5 to 2 degrees suggests upwards to about 6 degrees Celsius, which was regarded as the finite point of the existence of humanity. Now, within only the last 2 years, but much more alarmingly, only the last year, this narrative has been transformed to such a degree that 4 degrees Celsius warming as early as 2050 is now widely discussed, and this, of course, leaves out the possibility, which I'll talk just a little bit about here, of much more alarming trigger points, most likely by the release of methane gas, of which there are billions of tons under the Siberian tundra in particular. Methane is an especially poisonous gas, much more than carbon dioxide, which could trigger almost instantaneously, within a period of a year, a 10 degrees Celsius spike in warming, which of course would be completely catastrophic. Now the point is there are now degrees of catastrophe, all of which were regarded as extremely catastrophic at the time that this narrative began to unfold some 15 to 20 years ago. To expect that 4 degrees is realistic now was unthinkable in 2000. But in the last year, repeatedly, time and time again, this is the narrative we're presented with. I say as early as 2050, some push this back a little further to 2100. But one thing we can be certain of, all of the most alarming prognoses and predictions of the period from the late 1980s right up to about 2010 have all proven to be underestimates, both of the extreme temperatures to be reached and of the rate at which they would be reached. I'll give you a little bit of information about this here. So just some very basic facts, which people are presumably familiar with. Most carbon dioxide emissions come from fossil fuels, of course, which is why we have to hit first here. 87% of emissions come from gas, coal, and oil, of which 41% goes to electricity and heat generation. Coal is 43% of emissions, which is why coal is the single most important target at the moment. Now, this has historic national implications, of course, throughout Eastern Europe in a way which Britain, having killed off its coal mining industry by and large in the 1980s, doesn't recognize as a problem. But for Poland, for Hungary, for Romania, this is an industry which still employs very substantial numbers of people, and of course, much more to the point, many nations in Europe, not least Germany, rely still heavily on coal power. Whereas realistically, as you'll see from what I have to say, we shouldn't be taking coal out of the ground anymore, and it shouldn't be generating power at all, beginning immediately, as soon as we make our minds up that this is the catastrophe we are facing. So where then otherwise do emissions come from? Somewhere between 2.5% and maybe 8% comes from global aviation. Agriculture is about 12%. Concrete about 8%. Fashion probably about 8%. Transportation 22%. And this adds up more or less to the full picture. So globally, now this has a knock-on effect, and if I'd been able, with a bit of time and seen the earlier papers that were given, I would have tried to weave into my narrative an explanation for how the exponential growth in global inequality, both from the 1980s onwards, which is when the process starts, but much more specifically from, of course, 2008 onwards, has driven a further rapid rise in emissions rates. There's a very clear correlation between the two, but I didn't have time to offer precise statistics from this. Globally, however, the wealthiest 10% of the population generate about half of greenhouse gas emissions. The richest 1% generate about 80% of that 50%. So the wealthier you are, exponentially, the more you generate emissions. 24%, of course, come from the United States, with a population now of 340 million or so relative to the world's population of 7.68 or so billion now, so vastly disproportionate, of course. If we had time to go back to the legacy discussion of 1989, we would again try to address the issue of just how powerfully the American model was re-rendered by those events. Of course, the whole end of history narrative and the triumphalism of liberal democracy and so on was essentially a gloss on what were regarded by American political scientists and politicians, of course, as American achievements. This is an utterly tarnished vision, and it is tarnished 100 times over once we reverse the narrative and focus on the environment rather than on politics. Because the American model is fatal to the planet. It may have had some advantages politically. We've talked about this. There are pros and cons without doubt, but environmentally it's fatal. The model of consumer society is generated not just in the post-World War II period, but from the end of the 19th century onwards, is the key driver of the excess emissions that we have to deal with. So we have the potential then of a range now of taking 2100 as the benchmark here, somewhere between the current average, which is 1.1 degrees Celsius warming. Now, I'll go on in a moment just to remind you of what's happening with 1.1 degree warming, which is not 1.5 and not 2 degrees. It's well below what we regarded as comfortable from the 90s onwards. This is why I'm trying to argue finally by the end here, we need a completely different view of where we've come from and where we're going if we're to remedy this situation. So the approximate range that's leaving the question of spikes in warming, the 10 degrees that from time to time crops up that I suggested is a possibility. The average range in current discussions, but these change almost by the week, is a subject you have to follow virtually every day because the science is changing rapidly and the studies don't agree by any means. But this is not a sop to climate change deniers because 95% of the science is agreed and the 5% which isn't is highly suspect anyway. So we can relatively easily say 100% of the science is behind this scenario. So we're looking at if we were to remain exactly where we are now at 1.1 degrees Celsius warming up to perhaps 6.4% by the end of the century, leaving spikes aside. But reminding you again that 6 degrees was regarded as a complete catastrophe for all of humanity from about 2000, 2005 onwards, but is now presented to you as a realistic possibility. The average in warming at the moment is not, however, 1.1 degrees across the planet. That's a planetary average. In the Arctic, average warming is at 4 degrees Celsius. So this is the Canadian Arctic, this is the North Pole as well. Warming doesn't take place at the same pace across the planet. It is for us extremely unfortunate in a way that it is considerably higher, up to 4 times higher, precisely where we need ice retained in the glaciers of Greenland, in the higher peaks of the Himalayas and so on, but particularly in the Arctic. So the last time CO2, which is now at about 414 parts per million. Safe levels usually estimated at 350 million. Last time CO2 was this high, there were beech trees growing at the South Pole. The sea level was approximately 15, 18 meters higher than it is now. There was no ice sheet in Greenland, no West Antarctic ice sheet either. So let's then look at some of the implications of what I take to be the average between 2050 and 2100 projection of statistics from 2019 only. So 4 degrees. The World Bank, amongst other organizations, projects 4 degrees for about the 2060s. So kind of average in turn of higher projections, but occurring rather more rapidly. So the sea rise will produce an inundation, of course, of the coastal cities of the world. Projection here varies enormously, and this is one area where the science disagrees entirely. Anywhere from a 3-meter rise to a rise as high as 80 meters. Well, I'm not a scientist, but I will just give you the extremes. So about 16 million years ago, the temperature of the globe was between 5 and 8 degrees Celsius higher than it is now, and the sea level then was about 80 meters higher. So the extreme is not as unrealistic as we might imagine. So, of course, desertification, drought, diminution of the opportunities of food production will mean that at a time when demand for food by the middle of the century will go up by about 50%, it's possible that the percentage of land which can be used for agriculture will drop by the same percentage. There will be, and this is a timely intervention, the heat wave occurring in Northern Europe in this coming week, which is slated to bring temperatures in northern Germany up to 40 degrees Celsius, probably breaking summertime records there. This will, of course, become the norm. We've seen this year already records broken in California, in India, in parts of the Middle East. We saw last year in Spain and Portugal, again, 50 degrees Celsius is usually regarded as psychologically a kind of break point here. 50 degrees has already been broken in Pakistan and in some other areas. If 50 degrees were to become the summertime norm in Europe within 3 decades, of course, literally, our infrastructure would melt. The roads would melt, the telephone wires would melt. In a very substantial sense of the word, civilization as we understand it would simply melt into a puddle. And this is not unrealistic at all. So water scarcity, of course, some of you will have noticed Chennai, a city of 11 million in India, last week became the first major city in that region to go completely dry. The reservoirs are dry. India, of course, is a country slated to reach a population of 1 billion within a relatively short period of time. Water scarcity will be the norm for most of the country by 2050. Do the mathematics there. Another region which will become essentially uninhabitable with the medium level, but not even the worst case scenario here, is Australia, already possibly with a temperature rise of only 4 degrees, which I stress is now accepted as the probable norm by the majority of writers, serious writers on this subject. So, extraordinarily alarming in turn, this week, the statistic came out that the melting of the Siberian tundra, which is intimately linked to the possibility of the most extreme temperature spikes because of methane emission, is now occurring 70 years before it was predicted to occur only 20 years ago. Think that one through in turn, and you see that what is closing in on us is a nightmarish scenario which there is some reasonable possibility, I'm a gambling man, that the odds of survival of the species are rather less than about 5% by the end of the century. Now, I think we want all, of course, to think of our possible exit strategies from this most desperate scenario. We've never faced a crisis like this before. Even in our imagination, it's only the Christian millenarian tradition, to remain within Europe, which gives us a sense of what the apocalypse looks like psychologically. That is to say, how people subjectively and emotionally confront the possibility of the annihilation, not even of the whole population. Only the bad guys, after all, are defeated in the confrontation between Christ, Antichrist, the devil, and so on. Now the scenario is real, so we're not just playing around with theology and the possibility of everyone virtually dying. The end of the human species is a not unrealistic one. So obviously we have to think our way around this scenario. The mass panic will occur. I mean, the last half dozen pages of the Dystopia book, I wrote my own private dystopia. It's pretty grim, I have to say. I had fun writing it only because fiction is so much easier in a lot of ways to write than real history. With real history, your hands are always bound. What the facts say, so the historians will tell you, is what you have to replicate to the wider public. Whereas with fiction, you can do anything you want. The world is your oyster.
This is exactly what you did.
Or your desert, as the case may be. So what I imagine to be happening, even, this was finished only a couple of years ago, around 2015 or so, I would now portray in a much more kind of desperate way. So we have to confront the fact that as soon as the message sinks in, we will face mass panic. And panic of a kind which is completely unparalleled. We have to face the fact that most of the scenarios which I've outlined so far, and which you will read about every day on Twitter if you follow the climate alteration sites and the global warming sites and so on, most of them do not factor in the human reaction to what we confront. The human reaction, of course, is a social and political reaction as well. What happens when we confront not the mere, what the UN estimates the highest point will be 200 million climate refugees by the middle of this century? What happens when we're facing 2 billion or more climate refugees? What happens when the middle of the world, effectively, becomes an uninhabitable desert? Well, all the people who live in the middle of the world have to go somewhere else. Many countries in possession of nuclear weapons will witness countries proximate to their own, some of which also have nuclear weapons, in possession of large stretches of territory which are more habitable, which isn't to say habitable, but more habitable than the desert, which is increasingly their own, which, by the by, includes most of southern Europe, including this area, Greece, Italy, most of Spain, right up until the Pyrenees, even parts of southern France, depending on who you look at, depending on exactly what the temperature rise is and how we plot and calibrate the consequences. So the result, I think, is, and I will stop with this, it's been summed up very well by a recent book which I highly commend to everyone, David Wallace Wells's The Uninhabitable Earth, A Story of the Future, which is published by Alan Lane in 2019. Wallace Wells does an absolutely commendable job of describing what is technically in the business called the 6th mass extinction. There have been 5 of these beforehand. But the difference between, of course, the 6th and the 5 that came beforehand is that humanity is the cause of the 6th. And while humanity was around in one form or another, genealogically, at least in the 5th extinction, of course, the parallels drop off very quickly. There are relatively few by comparison with the present. So Wallace Wells does not pull any punches. He goes for, by and large, what even in 2015 we would have regarded as very extreme scenarios. He gives us just a few sobering facts, which I would remind you of. If the Paris Accords were implemented now, 3.2 degrees warming would result. So the Paris Accords are not going to be implemented, of course, not least because Mr. Trump is such an asshole. Am I allowed to say that in these proceedings? It's not diplomatic language.
There you free
go.
To use it.
I don't know what the local equivalent is, but choose your own term. He warns us that, quote, page 31 of the book, warming of 3 or 3.5 degrees would unleash suffering beyond anything that humans have experienced. At 11 to 12 degrees, which a spike would enable, so that's to say the worst case scenario with the spike, not 6 degrees, not even 8, but 10, and then tipping over further, 50% of the world's population would die directly from the heat. And the other 50% probably not very long afterwards either. So what this means, of course, my hero is Greta Thunberg, the activist who has helped to bring about the movement known as Extinction Rebellion, which is the single most important source of hope now for the possibility of direct civil disobedience to bring to the attention of our governments and the rest of the population the immediacy and urgency of the problem. Greta Thunberg tells us, I don't want your hope, the great utopian principle, of course, from Ernst Bloch. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act. The house is on fire. The one thing we need more than hope is action. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. Well, where does the hope lie? My final observation here. We've had two dominant paradigms to go back to 1989, the supposed triumph of St. George over the dragon, the capitalist St. George over the communist dragon, of course. Both of these paradigms, liberalism and Marxism, produce an unsustainable vision of unlimited production, consumption, expansion of population. As far as creating a sustainable world is concerned, there's no difference whatsoever between them. So the argument is no longer liberalism versus Marxism. We may revisit Marx, I think it's important to do so, but it only has a kind of stopping base or halfway house to rethinking an entirely new critical perspective. That's to say, a paradigm which places the necessity of a sustainable society first and foremost before us and demands that we act immediately to implement it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very sobering image of the not so distant future, but of our immediate future. In the meantime, I would like to greet Professor Jan Reusen. He comes all the way from Bochum in one piece with his wife, Inga Reusen. Hello. Logistically and adventurously, he is, and both are here, thanks to a combination of the delay of their flight from Düsseldorf due to a large extent to global warming, just as the delay of Greg's flight last night and counting, and the delay of Victor's flight last night as well. So we are deeply into this thing. This is the brochure of a conference which was organized by Jörn in 2002. This is the conference where Greg and I met discussing utopianism, and the discussion never stopped. At the time, let's say the focus of our discussion about utopia was this the cultural dimension of the imagination of alternative society. And the metaphor which works very well in German, not so well in other languages, as always, is that in the title in German was die Unruhe der Kultur. This restlessness is in fact the very pedestrian name of a mechanism, of the clockwork mechanism. This is the mechanism that regulates the clock. And in fact, the clock was ticking, by the way, in a very alarming way already at the time. At the time, we were concentrating on culture and society, and most of the interventions were based precisely on that. Meanwhile, 17 years later, or almost, the annual conference of the Utopian Science Studies Society is in a few days opening in Prato on the 1st of July. And the theme is, of course, ecological utopias or green utopias. This has been a topic in utopian writing basically forever. This basically comes back to the forefront of specialists in utopian writing, and not a moment too soon, because as you could gather from Greg's presentation, these are really urgent issues. I would like to just go through a number of points here to place the grim statistics into a larger picture, even larger picture. First of all, a vision of, different visions of a green utopia have existed and have accompanied human civilizations from the beginning. From the Garden of Paradise or Pardes, taken up by the Old Testament authors from the pre-existing Persian, Assyrian, Babylonian traditions and so on, melted into this vision of paradise that is depending on water, namely on the confluence of 4 rivers at least. The lack of rain, but the rivers are there anyway. So visions of good human society from paradise down are very much predicated on a harmonious proportion between water, land, vegetation, animals, and humans. And so these visions dramatically diverge from culture to culture, but they already include, and this we know quite well, the disappearance, the extinction of the human species. In most traditions, the flood or the various floods or the other natural catastrophes are connected to the trial and error behavior of various gods and creators who are trying their hands, as it were, at making the perfect human. They didn't do it from the first, where they did in some cyclical visions of the world. They did it right first, and then everything down followed. It was a decline of the human species. In other visions, it was a different spiral moving up from rudimentary, failed attempts at creating man or the human being towards, you see, absolutely messianic, godlike or golem-like, depending on how you read it, visions of the Homo faber, who can actually, in an act that combines a mystique of Promethean humanity that is replacing God as the ultimate creator or transformer of the cosmos, to visions of, simply reckless human beings, decayed in every way, in every imaginable way, that actually bring this world as we know it to an end, to usually a catastrophic end. So this has been a topic of utopian literature in general and of myth for thousands of years. What has become, I think, to my mind, alarming in the last 30 years, because we discussed this period 1989 to 2019, has been the speed and the depth of this transformation. And I'll give you just one example. Consumer society has become the only vision of the world for probably the vast majority of the world population. Only those who cannot afford it do not join the ranks of consumer society. This is obviously the ideal. And the funniest examples for me are these initiatives such as the Earth Day, where the planet, where this and that, when they switch off electricity for, let's say, 5 minutes or 2 hours, whereas for the rest of the year, they exploit whatever gadgets they can possibly have, depending on electricity, thus on fuel, on fossil fuels and so forth. So the very interesting hypocrisy that has developed in Western societies and is being gradually exported to underdeveloped or developing societies, and that includes China, this extraordinary schizophrenia that combines pleas for frugality for 5 minutes with a kind of a cornucopia of absolute orgiastic consumption. And these two, frugality going on all the way up to asceticism, you know, from veganism to whatever forms you can find there, to incredibly high rates of consumption of everything on a daily basis. These, to me, define the, let's say, the schizophrenic, double-bind situation in which the current society lives. Now, Romania and Eastern Europe they all have joined this world 30 years ago. And I can still imagine the pre-1989 situation of scarcity, which has inspired otherwise interesting economic theories like that one by János Kornai, the shortage economy, a situation in which the basic economic mechanisms were supposed to, or reorganized in a socialist, really existing socialist country in order to cope with the scarcity of objects, not only of resources. I amended this theory a little bit, adding that pre-modern societies surviving quite into our modern life of the 1960s, 70s, 80s in Eastern Europe, and in parts of Western Europe, of rural Western Europe, meant that people were used to the rarity, to the ontological absence of objects. The room around them was not filled up to capacity with objects. So if you want to think back to decades, then centuries of world history, even in societies that would be more or less well-to-do, even by our standards, they would eat to their needs, they would have shelter, they would have this. So all the bare necessities of life would be met, and sometimes with an extra margin of comfort and security. All these societies are relatively recent. This is a recent experience of the Homo sapiens. To be surrounded by, or even flooded, if I use the terminology, this vocabulary, surrounded and flooded by objects. This ontological replacement of Lebensraum with a room, a space filled up with objects, usually that are to be consumed, whose shelf life were at home, not in the shop, or whose usability is far from being impressive, because sometimes you buy an object that you throw away the next morning or the next 5 minutes. So this has changed the world people imagine an alternative. And I think the most difficult situation in our thinking of the future is simply to endow current human beings with the capacity of coping with the sheer, if not absence, but at least scarcity or accepted voluntary scarcity of. We know the discourse about that, which has started also with the most alarmist news about fossil fuels and global warming in the 1960s. We know how pleas for the limitation of growth, the voluntary limitation of growth, were around the year 1970 the mantras of all societies in the world. They were read, I have to tell you, with mixed feelings by Eastern Europeans who were sentenced to scarcity. Anyways, I couldn't quite convincingly join the bandwagon of spiraling down of various economic projects. Then it was preached to the third world, quite persuasively, they thought, by the West, while relocating all the heavy industry first and then consumer goods industry precisely to those locations, and asking them to comply to norms that were invented and even legalized through treaties and so forth only later. So the West had had its cake, had eaten more than its share before, and now was transporting this vision of a frugal, voluntarily frugal future to the outskirts of the known world, which of course the Chinese really could not appreciate, because they had run the course of world economy for up until 1750 quite successfully without destroying the planet with overproduction. You remember the first exchanges between Western missionaries who go, it started with Marco Polo, but we had our share in it. Someone who we think was a Romanian, but not exactly anyhow, because his name is not quite clear. Romanians would recognize Nicolae Eminescu Spătaru, 16th century. He was the first European to cross from St. Petersburg all the way to Beijing on land. And of course, he discovered all kinds of bizarre things along the way. The most shocking experience he had after actually talking to the emperor, who actually was a young emperor, received him and listened carefully and so forth. And then he came up with various business proposals, as we would say today, from the Tsar. And the emperor said calmly that we don't need any of whatever you say, do trade and so on. He said, no, we don't need any of this. But how about this? No, absolutely no. It's fine, but you might, no, very nice. Thanks for coming by. They gave him nice gifts for the Tsar and goodbye. And you see a self-sufficient society that lived in scarcity and frugality, but not necessarily in famine and catastrophe, refusing the proposal coming all the way from Russia, brought up by a Romanian. So we have tried before to do this kind of transcultural transmission of ways of life. And now we see that the planet is definitely suffocated and flooded once again by this. I don't see how, with the exception of a number of idealists, and mind you, a small number of idealists, growing but still small, anyone can influence the policies of the various national governments, and even worse, the policies of multinationals. Because I think we live in a situation of total duplicity where nation states can sign up treaties that can set wonderful, rules and maximum this and that, and the multinationals would simply go around those interdictions. Can you simply talk back to Google, or can you find anyone at Amazon.com that would answer your call? I'm not sure. The other thing is that another use of history which I see, the extraordinary hypocrisy of the so-called ecologically friendly with biological, or in Germany, biologisch dynamisch, or agriculture and things like this. The enormous capacity of lying about the core operation. They are asking you to buy coffee beans from some remote mountain in some jungle and so forth, pretending that you have to pay all this steep price because this is part of this is shared with the local producers and encourages the. We all know that this is a joke, of course, and this is part of a huge commercial system that is simply so immensely developed that I think it came to be more, to be stronger than, and they also have their lobbies, because when you read lots of, even scientists, handsomely paid, I presume, debunking the thing about global warming. You remember that from about 20 years ago already, there has been a global decade for the study of weather, also with the suspicion of climate change. And the conclusion of this effort, which was under the high patronage of the United Nations, so forth, it was like this, as Snoopy, one of Young's favorite characters, said memorably, maybe yes, maybe not. So it was not clear after a decade of scientific measurements, of studies, of this and that, whether global warming was, this was 15 years ago, with a very strong lobby simply debunking the very notion of global warming and rejecting it as just a mythology of the left and of some idealistic freaks. They go around the world, hugging trees and eating another fructarians and all these extreme forms of friends of the planet. Now, we joined this discussion so late that in Eastern Europe this seems simply not only useless but cynical. We have sadomasochistic young Eastern Europeans who have joined all these movements. They are young, now they are reaching the maturity. This generation, which was coming of age around 1989, is now around 50, 45, 50 years of age and over. They are now starting to develop reflexes and forms of reflection that were absorbed as they were growing up, and the new generation without the experience of pre-1989 and without a very good memory of what was going on in the 1990s, which were rather brutal years, they are also ready to embrace such visions. In the meantime, they are hired for not so great wages by multinationals, and they are happy. They live their moment of welfare, which is going to last until the next move of multinational capital to poorer countries. So their only hope is that there will be a flood or a massive disappearance, regional human extinction, some other in India and so forth, which would place Romanian workers, in a great competitive position, since all these people will be flooded or dying from thirst out there in the desert. It's hard. I also want to say just one paragraph about the cultural dimension of what people understand of their shared experience as a species in the world. I once gave a talk in Britain, and I recommended students of literature to revise from the point of view of the weather report their readings of classical British literature. And I said, look, the Ode to the Daffodils was nice, but in the Lake District, the daffodils come in bloom in April now, or slowly. I was living in London, and I saw on the image of daffodils coming in bloom. And I looked at I had such a surprise. I looked at the calendar. I said, my goodness. And of course, if you look at the diaries of the romantic English poets, you see that the dates are in May, June. They were enjoying these flowers coming into bloom much later than we do today. So one could imagine the rewriting of a history of world literature from the point of view of weather changes, and the dates would be simply absolutely confusing, and where the very presence of some cultures that are now unintelligible to us, whereas some human practices of even societies that were highly developed for their time and had everything, capitals of empires, Babylon, where things that were Rome, were Athens, where their vision of plenty was based on trade a lot, of course, exploitation of others who were their subalterns, but also on the intelligent use of dystopia came up for the last time, as I know, in a serious work of monumental scholarship, in the work of Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss was able to see how in deserts out there in South America, or in other places of the world, people we would see a desert, and the natives would see plenty of animals, maybe, and the insects wouldn't be so enticing, but of plants, of mushrooms, of things like that were edible to them, were not killing them, and had disappeared from the food map of civilization completely, and were replaced with things one buys from the supermarket. Let us invite comments and interventions from the floor. So please feel free. We have covered a number of issues. We talked about, I talked about, let's say, the categories in which we could think this period, 1989 to 2019. And in fact, we witness a fusion of dystopia and posthistoire. Our present and increasingly our future becomes a dystopian, post-historical world. And I think this is new in civilizational terms. I am following discussions in our Society of Utopian Studies. I'm absolutely stunned by the frequency of papers that are submitted for presentation in the annual conference that deal with these issues. And the younger they are, the more concerned they are with things that should concern us, the older guys more. And I see there a kind of hope, a sign of hope, that people are considering something beyond, let's say, the animalic, post-historical existence. You know that the vision of the end of history came with this unpleasant vision of man becoming a kind of animal that is being devoid. This is a Nietzschean theme, but theme that it was connected with the Hegelian and Kantian theme of the end of history. That is the idea that people, human beings, become more and more, or regress to their animal condition by being devoid of ambition, of this and that, of will, you know, of the force of will and things like that. Increasingly, we are looking at this.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting and a bit scary.
Very scary.
I was thinking about, while you were talking, I was thinking about Eastern Europe, Romania, and thinking about how in the last years there's been some kind of renegotiation, repolicing of the borders between nature and politics, even in Eastern Europe. But it's going in various and strange ways. For once, it's former deindustrialized areas are now marketed as future nature protected, tourist-oriented areas, and it's not going very well, actually. On the other hand, there is some kind of this strange social conditions, a bit phantasmatic in the middle classes, have become enamored with some kind of image of nature. For example, here in Bucharest, we have Parcul Bucharest Park, which is a very strange and in a way very telling combination of historical ruins, socialist ruins, with ruins of the post-socialist period, because there was an area where nothing was built, and now it has been declared a national park because it has been endangered in a way.
It's a wetland now.
It's a wetland. It used to be some kind of part of a hydrological project during the socialist times. It failed, and then during all the 90s and 2000s was nothing. And now it's nature. I mean, it's a total creation of nature out of socialist ways. And it's the most focal point of nature for middle class Bucharest, or for middle class. Mm-hmm. So it's the relationship with nature is very, I would say that it's complicated in Eastern Europe. Especially, we did not have an ecological movement, neither during the socialist times nor afterwards. Even if in other socialist countries there was some kind of socialist of ecological movement. Yeah. Even if only to be able to talk back to power, because if you have nature on your side, you can talk back even to...
Even Bulgarians, as we say in Romania, even the Bulgarians had one.
Also in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, yeah.
It had a nationalistic tinge in Russia, but still it was ecological and it was political. None of this happened in Romania as far as I know. But now there's also this increase in nature protected areas, which happened in the 2000s, especially after the accession to the European Union. And so it's some kind of renegotiating our relationships to nature, which is does not have this catastrophic hinge you presented, because it's, well, if really these things are going to happen, then even nature does not matter anymore. So I was wondering if this catastrophic narrative does not have this kind of, I mean, if really this is happening, what can we do? I mean, let's just enjoy ourselves.
Absolutely.
Right.
So this was
right. We start with easy questions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you may want to respond to this as well.
Just shortly to this, to clarify the Romanian context. This love of nature by the urbanites, the young urbanites, comes also to replace, in a very oblique way, the fact that many of these guys in the cities are second or first generation urbanites. They come from the countryside, and they had to distance that vision of nature, which was basically a deep antipathy, because nature meant basically going out there to work, and that was not always pleasant. This antipathy, so first there was a need to separate yourself from everything rural, in order for the rural to become fashionable and cool again. In Romania was probably the last country in Eastern Europe that joined this process. It has happened in terms of the vision of the young urbanites of folklore, folk dances, music, and so forth. There was a process of distanciation through urbanization of education from peasant values, from songs to dances to cows and so forth, right? So this process has lasted longer in more developed Central European countries. Romania has discovered this a little bit late. And they are still on a learning curve. Romantic Romanian culture, literature, and so forth has also idealized nature to extreme extents in order because the lack of documents attesting to various qualities of the imaginary, mostly of the Romanian, I was about to say Hungarian, of the Romanian psyche were to be linked to some kind of Edenic nature, of paradisal nature that somehow was surviving only in our space. The way this enchanted sheep, Miorița, that was talking and was doing lots of things. So the process of this distancing, this recent peasant condition, was then transformed, picked up, and transformed into a cool urbanite attitude towards nature. So now people are going, climbing mountains, collecting this, eating rotten apples from the countryside rather than beautiful big apples like this from the supermarket. So we are still in a transition of that. I was trying to give you the Romanian context of.
So can it be prevented? Answer is yes. We have about 10 years. It requires immediate attention, however. Rewilding is the phrase in English. Very important part of this. We need to plant about 1 trillion trees. That will reduce by at least 10% the warming throughout this period. We have to move to a much lower goal, namely below 1 degree Celsius. So below, because we know 1.1 degrees, the notional average now for the planet, is much too high. And 1.5 to 2 is completely unrealistic, never mind anything above that. We could probably, starting in about 5-6 years, reach the 3.2 degrees that it's estimated we're on a trajectory for now with the Paris Agreement in place and actually operating. Obviously, slamming the brakes on now means not just rewilding, but the replacement of all current sources of carbon emission by renewables, whole host of other measures. Individuals can act and have to act, but crucially, of course, it's 71% of emissions come from 100 companies. Those companies need to be targeted first and foremost. So I would say not only can it be done, but you can do it in part yourself, but we need to think about exactly what we can do ourselves. But that's not the majority of what needs to be done. The majority of what needs to be done can only be done by changing corporate behavior and by acting through governments. But you alone are not going to affect that change in their behavior. You can only affect that by joining an organization which is willing to engage in civil disobedience to put this issue squarely before governments and the public. Unfortunately, that's the only way it's going to work. And we've had 2,000 arrested in London in April. Their trials are now coming up. No one is quite sure if there's a new election is possible. The Labour Party will pardon them all. Some conservatives are very keen on seeing the most draconian penalties applied to all of those who engage in such civil disobedience. Next time, we will have 20,000 arrested. And even if they all go to jail, after that, it'll be 200,000, till the system breaks down.
So the Garden City is going to finally exist, with people growing potatoes in prison yards.
The time frame makes this the only possible way forward, unfortunately. If we were starting a century earlier, we could do it more gradually, much more easily, without the pain. The pain is going to come, but the choice is no choice at all.
The only solution to an anarchist political movement.
Yes, yeah.
Quite anarchist, may I?
Catalin Mamale, say, of course.
You mentioned before the necessity of a massive civil disobedience as a way to prevent catastrophe. And I'm thinking that the concept as such, developed by Henry David Thoreau, is not by chance separate from ecological crisis. Few people use Thoreau in both ways, as a social scientist, as a reformer through self-experience, and one of the pioneers of ecology.
Indeed.
What he did at Walden, he did a self-experience. Now, here is my question, because it is related to your presentation. Why do you think that Thoreau is marginalized, both by Marxists and by many liberals? You find very few citations, either of civil disobedience and such, or of Walden, in comparison with the Marxist analysis of economical processes. His main idea is what's the cost. The cost should be treated in cost of living.
So that's a really good question. Actually, I have been thinking about this quite a bit lately. Reading through the history of environmentalism and the most recent environmental literature, Thoreau, of course, is a key figure, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic, but virtually everywhere, has a profound influence in Europe as well. I think the problem lies in the Walden Pond model, the so-called one person or one man, it's usually called the one person utopia ideal. The notion that it's possible to conceive of a solution to all the things I talked about as one person fleeing from society as a whole doesn't provide us with an answer. Now that's the ecological Thoreau, if you like. On civil disobedience, Thoreau, of course, is ought to be referred to by everyone who realizes that you reach a point where the system is intransigent and has to be fought at this most elementary level. And dare one hazard a prophecy, Thoreau will be read and quoted on a very large scale in the coming years.
Thoreau could walk from Walden Pond and his cabin to Concord, Massachusetts, where his mother was living. Would walk. And he would walk every day, as we know from an indiscreet friend of his mother's, who in her diary said once, "What a wonderful son Henry was. Even in his time of complete isolation at Walden Pond, he would have tea with his mother every day." This was discovered by his biographer Leon Idei in a wonderful book, I think probably forgotten from about 30, 40 years ago, that would be worth rereading. And of course, he was suffering in complete solitude. In winter, however, winters are very harsh at Walden Pond, so he would retreat in the comfort of his mother's, parental house. And that is, to me, also because it is a kind of Robinsonade. It is a one-man project.
I would contradict you a bit here. It is a self-experience, social nature. And he had very clear ideas. He did try to test what are human basic
needs. Yes, basic needs, of course, absolutely, yeah.
This is his starting point. Was he with the society? Yes. He was not separated completely from society. And he had two more important ideas. One was related to his master, self-reliance.
Yes, absolutely.
And the second, from a methodological viewpoint, is the following. You cannot study truly anything if during your research, knowledge process, you destroy the object. This is what we do in social sciences here in Romania. Maybe you do, because I'm outside.
I don't.
And it's done all over. And he was for unobtrusive research, which is an idea which should be well considered in political science.
That's true. Now, there is then, maybe one point I would add to this, because Thoreau was mentioned in discussions about ideology, politics, and let's say the greening of the planet, or the re-greening of the planet. I want to stress a point which I'm going to make in Prato at the conference in several days, which is this. This is a meta-political, trans-ideological notion, ecology. It happened to the best of us. Now it is more popular on the left. But the Nazis were very high on that chapter as well. And the point is whether you actually can imagine a modern, whereas a future-oriented vision of society, not an anti-modern, which is still looking ahead, not a retrograde vision of society, which means giving up all the things. All these possibilities have been mentioned, right? Because if the price one pays is the abandonment of everything we treasure and are important for our civilization, this is a voluntary act of self-mutilation that very few people would subscribe to. The point is to be so wise as to, yes, give up those things that are not, to define your needs in a really wise way, not to deprive the human species of some of the things that were hardly earned and became important for the human species as a species, including the knowledge infrastructure, things of this sort. Because that is, there are utopias or dystopias of the not so distant future based on a vision of complete renaturalization of a neo-Arcadian society that has lost, because not all Arcadias are so rigorous and frugal, we have to remember. To strike a balance between the abandonment of everything that is making human life palatable, as it were, or acceptable, and everything that is in excess. And this needs a society, this needs a radical cultural revolution, a really radical cultural transformation. Because what do you make of those? For this, my plea is always for the relaunching of humanities as the core field of study for humans of all walks of life, things of this sort. But I don't see the signs, because the point is not to other Arcadians or Arcadias or based on left wing or right wing, conservative. Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand's world is an Arcadian, frugal world. I leave you I leave out the other aspects which I simply laugh at in this cruel society. But the vision of frugality was there. So there are very interesting differences between the visions of future frugality. They were already in utopia. We discussed last year so much about, because it was the 500 years anniversary of Utopia, the writing by Morris. That was a society of frugality, and he wanted to. Wherein gold, of course, despite you do ugly things with gold and keep it, to invest it in on the continent, in the real world, to have other people fighting wars for you. The idea of subcontractors was early in, maybe these guys in Pentagon have read, I didn't know about that. So the thing is to define frugality in such a way that does not deprive us of traditions that were acquired in the course of the history of our species, and would be an enormous loss and a trigger of a deeply dehumanizing new life in the name of. And I have seen in pleas for this kind of frugality, extreme forms of frugality, a dehumanizing, because there is something, and this is going to be my last point, right? These are all connected to discussions about a post-human future, of post-humanity. The idea of human extinction, which has become, they all sound very suicidal to me whenever I listen to them. And sometimes I see really quite I mean, really I'm worried sometimes, you know, for the authors, the proponents of these interpretations, because they really seem quite beyond pessimism, that is in a kind of suicidal mode, not only mood. And this is also a symptom of, you know, the fear and the anxiety that is related to this feeling of imminent catastrophe. There are these people who are smarter than others and that become suicidal before the end of the world, you know, to have the last laugh by themselves and leave us to our misery to perish with the world, or together with the planet. They go out first, you know, from the picture. For many years, and for 30 years, obviously, many people in Eastern Europe, percentage-wise, more people in Romania, have thought of their lives in contradistinction to Western Europe. This has been, they had something we didn't have, we would like to be this, and there is a popular slogan of the young generation demonstrated in the streets: we want to have a country like the ones abroad. Vrem o țară ca afară. They, of course, do not, you know, specify the means and ways to get there, and what exactly that means. But the idea is that we would like to have a country like the others have. No, I'm not so sure that I would go out there in the street and shout this slogan. I'm not always sure that at this time Western European countries really offer us the models that we should, yeah, in many respects, of course. The gap is so huge. But not everything that the West has done over the last 30 years is usable or respectable or should be kept and emulated. And this is not easy for countries in Central and Eastern Europe that for centuries, and at least for the history of modernity, have been engaged in a kind of mimetic competition with the West and was imitating, emulating all the time. Now they are left with a situation in which not everything can be or should be imitated from whatever happens in the West. And now there are, with a quarter of Romania's population having direct experience of life in the West, probably this enthusiasm for the West is going to subside significantly and remain as a phantasmatic horizon, but not connected to the realities of, because most of these people in the so-called and hailed Romanian diaspora live lives that are not political, that are they are not integrated in their societies in most ways, not necessarily because they would be rejected, simply they couldn't care less. They become active, a fraction of them, let's say up to 10% of them, go frantic for a day or two on various days, election days, every now and then. Then they disappear, and they reappear, or you know, they are featured once more as actors of political life in Romania. They have left sometimes 15 years ago. Suddenly they become the model and the ideal of the population that was left behind. So these are complications of living in a periphery. A periphery that in many ways was absorbed by the European project. But and now there is more room in the European Union with Brexit, so there will be more really room in the European Parliament and everywhere. imagine all this empty Lebensraum now created by Brexit. But the situation to me is that, living in such times of turmoil, we are less oriented and less firm in our visions and fantasies than we were in 1989. And that is something that is just unfolding. And I really fear the consequences of this kind of living without a living model, of relegating the envisioning of the good society to something which is purely abstract, and of being unable to connect that kind of visionary projection of future, of alternative futures, relegating that to theory and becoming unable to connect it to really existing countries. On this optimistic note, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to close our thing here, our debate. We started early at 2 p.m. Thank you very much. I would like to use this opportunity also to thank the team here at Muzeul Municipiului Bucharest for assisting me in this program, which now comes to the end of the second year. And I was very happy to be, offering some of my wisdom and my reflections from this table with guests. Some of them are here present. So thank you all. You can see this again and again and again on YouTube at the address. You know, don't shy away, take notes, come back, and we'll resume our cycle of ideas in the Agora in the fall, on the 24th of September. So once again, let me say hello to Jan Wiesen, who is going to receive the 6th Cantemir Prize tomorrow in a short ceremony. Thank you very much, and see you later after the summer break. I think